about 9 times the speed of sound. Roger.
Hey guys, my name is Emil and I'd like to welcome you to my W201 restoration project. If you missed episode 1, you can feel free to click up here to get the full background info on the vehicle behind me. A quick summary before we jump in. What we're dealing with is a 1993 190E 2.6 W201 chassis Mercedes that I gave to my dad for his 60th birthday. Now, unfortunately for him, the vehicle needs a full restoration. The brakes are done, suspension is completely done, and the engine that I planned to put in this car, the OM602, needed a bit of work. The first thing we did is we started the engine in the chassis as it was to try and figure out if it runs. Now, it started very quickly, even though it hasn't been running about 5 years. However, there's a bit of a knocking sound going on in the engine. It smokes quite a lot, and it generally does not run very well. So what we did is we went down the path of trying to figure out very quickly, hopefully, what the issues with this motor were. Unfortunately for us, the background history is very unclear because the previous owner was a bit of a donut, to be honest. He didn't know what he had. He didn't really maintain it very well. So we kind of started off with a blank slate and tried to figure out, can we save this motor? The first thing we did is we pulled the injectors out to have an inspection, and we quickly realized that injector number 5 actually has a seized nozzle. So that kind of gave us a little bit of hope that we can get this up and running. I went ahead and picked up new nozzles and we balanced and rebuilt the injectors. So now I've got 5 injectors that are rebuilt in a very good condition, the same pop pressure, so they should be working very good. The next thing I did is I stripped the motor down, gave it a nice clean job, and unfortunately decided to open the valve cover to just inspect the mechanical components underneath, just to make sure there's really no physical damage to the motor before we go ahead and start putting the new injectors in. I say unfortunately, but we're lucky that we did that because we would have had issues had we put that back in the car. The first thing, and we're gonna go in a little bit closer, but the one thing you can notice here right off the bat is that the camshaft is worn out. Now, it's not worn out in a matter that screams, physical damage or overheating or anything like that. It appears to be worn out from age. Okay, the lobes across the board are worn out the exact same manner, and unfortunately, I can't, with a clear and cautious, close this motor up and throw it in the car. That meant that we had to start looking at options. Okay, and when I say options, we had to figure out what we're gonna do about either fixing this motor or trying to figure out a different engine that we can put in the vehicle. And this is where the OM606 comes into the picture. Now, in episode 1, I talked about the the couple of different Mercedes diesels that my dad bought about at the same time. And one of them was a 1999 W210 Mercedes E300 diesel with the OM606 engine. Unfortunately for that car, it's built out of rust, really. So what we ended up doing is we pulled the engine out of the vehicle and we threw away the chassis. That was a couple of years ago because, frankly, there was no point in trying to rescue it. So we had this motor. It's been sitting in the garage for a couple of years now. A little bit of interesting thing, I've had it for sale for probably about 2.5 years for quite a reasonable price, what I would say. And I've never had that much interest in a motor that I've had for sale and not been able to sell it. So everybody wants an OM606 and nobody wants to pay any money for it. Certainly not in North America. Now, if you're watching this video, there's a good chance you know what an OM606 is. And if you don't, very quickly, this is kind of the 2JZ of the diesel world. This is one of the best Mercedes diesel engines ever built. It's built on the platform of the OM603, sort of the next generation. And it's followed by the OM613, which is the 6-cylinder common rail. This motor is well known and a lot of folks are pushing upwards of twice more horsepower than it came from originally, which is about 177 horsepower from the factory. There's a couple of shortcomings with the motor that make it sort of a bit of a problem to swap in, and we're going to talk about it when I get into a comparison between the two. But It is a very sought after engine because it will support a lot of horsepower in stock format. In other words, you don't have to really get into upgrading pistons, that kind of stuff, because the engine is built very, very well. And this gets us to the point of today's video. Pros and cons on both. This, I already mentioned, is simple. It is mechanically driven. It's relatively cheap. And frankly, it's a good motor. All right. Now, stock from the factory, this comes at about 125 horsepower compared to the 177 horsepower that the 606 supports. The problem is that when we start thinking about, when I start doing the options analysis about what we're going to put in the car, I have to consider the issues with the camshaft. Now, to get this repaired, there's a couple of different ways we can go about it. One way or another, I have to get a camshaft. All right. Once I get the camshaft, I have to undo the timing. So I might as well go ahead and take the head out and get the head refreshed with new valve seals. Probably not new valves, but maybe new valve guides, head gasket, bolts, the new lifters. It basically kind of starts adding up. All right. From a money point of view, it's not too bad. However, the camshaft, for example, is not available in North America. I have to bring it in from Europe, or it's about $600, $700 from the dealership coming in from Germany. So it makes things a little bit complicated and kind of delays us quite a bit. That said, after I've spent about $500 to $1,000, I get a fairly decent motor that's relatively easy to put in the car, and we already know that it mounts, everything fits. So this is the option on this motor. Once we get into talking about the 606, we start dealing with a couple of different issues. Okay, primarily, once Mercedes went into the electronic fuel pump, you start having an issue with how you're going to control this engine into the older chassis. I mentioned this is a mechanical fuel pump, so as long as you give it fuel and crank the engine, the pump will run and the engine will run. This guy requires quite a lot of electronics and a computer to make it run. Now, that's not a showstopper. It makes swapping the motor a little bit harder. So there's a couple of different ways we can get this working. And if you are interested in OM 606, you probably know most of these options anyways. The preferred, I would say, option is to get an OM 603 mechanical pump. So a mechanical pump of the 6-cylinder version of this engine, which is a direct swap into the 606. So that allows you to delete all of the electronics off the motor and basically get the benefits of running, the 24 valve solid bottom end with the mechanical advantage of not having to deal with any electronics to make this engine run. So that's a good option. Most people that get this motor will go with that route because that allows you to put that engine into pretty much anything you want to without really worrying about the electrical system and that kind of stuff. The problem with that option is that you have to find a good pump. Chances are that's going to be a little bit hard to do, and frankly, they're not necessarily cheap. An OM603 pump, I think cheapest one on eBay right now, when I looked at it yesterday, was about $400, $500, and that's not a rebuild pump. That's basically a pump with, I would argue, unknown mileage, unless you're trusting the seller, in an unknown condition. So you're going to get this pump and hope that it worked well. The second option you can go about doing with the engine is to get the stock electronic control module, the engine control module, the ECM, and basically wire everything up so that you use the entire, the wiring harness, all of the sensors, and the stock module. The main problem you're going to have with that is the immobilizer. So the W210 starts having an immobilizer where this engine will not run if you just try to crank it without having the entire immobilizer system with it. So you've got two options. You can either transplant the whole thing into whatever chassis it is you're working with, or you can try and defeat the immobilizer. To defeat the immobilizer, there's a couple of videos on YouTube. I'm going to share a link there. But basically, it's not entirely complicated per se. So it's probably, I would argue, it's probably the cheapest option that you can have to put this motor into a different car and get it running. Okay, so what you do is you retain the stock wiring harness, you retain all of the stock sensors with the issues that come with that, you retain the stock pump, and you basically run the engine as it was from the factory. Your third option is to have a standalone engine management system. They're not too bad, they're not too expensive. The one that I've been reading on is called a DSL1. quite a few folks running it. Unfortunately, not really a lot of information that I personally found as to, how do you plug it in, how do you do the harness, how do you program it, how easy was it to set up, and so on and so forth. It's a good option. Honestly, if I had to pick between that and perhaps swapping in the mechanical pump, I think I would rather choose that, because that allows you to actually program and tune the engine, and gives you quite a little bit more options in terms of what you're going to do down the future. You don't have to, not everything is going to be mechanically adjusted. You can actually start getting into the benefits of the electronic control. So those are your three main options. Cost wise, like I said, the cheapest is to get the immobilizer defeated and have this engine running in its entire stock form. I already have the harness, I have all the sensors, so that's the option that I've chosen as my sort of first go-to. I would say the second one is the standalone management system, because it gives you the advantage of the electronic control of the motor, and it allows you to tune it down the road. So if you want to increase the boost, whatever the case is. That's the second. And the third option, which most people will choose, depending on their application, would be the mechanical pump. So there's a difference between the two engines and sort of the issue that you're going to encounter about trying to fit them in the car. Now, there's a couple of constraints on my project that kind of drive the choice that I'm going to make in regards to which engine is going to end up in there. And primarily it is related to schedule and budget. Obviously, pretty much every project is the same. As far as schedule goes, I have to get this car out of this garage before the 1st of May 2021. It is now January, which gives me about 4 months. That's kind of a hard deadline. I can't really push it past that. And frankly, if it goes beyond that, this car is going to sit around for another couple of years without really being driven, because I'm not going to have the time to get in and start fiddling with other stuff that are outstanding. So I would say that's a very hard deadline, and this engine, whichever one it is, has to be running by the 1st of May, which gives me a bit of a tight deadline. The second constraint is the budget. So my entire budget for this build was about $5,000, and I'm at about half of that right now. So the car with an engine, with all of the parts all of the money I've spent on the suspension, the brakes, and everything else so far, I'm at about 25 to 3 grand. Which does not leave me with a whole lot of money to be doing sort of fancy stuff such as a diesel mech and pump, for example, whatever the case is. So that's a bit of an issue on its own. So that's my preference. I want to get the OM606 into this vehicle. I think the value for the project would be tremendous compared to the 602. And I'm not saying this is a bad motor. It's an excellent motor, and I'm sure I'm going to rebuild it and sell it or put it in something else. But for this particular car, what I'm trying to do for my dad, I think this would be a much more interesting option. I cannot end this video without a discussion about the transmission. Chances are, if you've looked into this before, if you're curious about this swap, you know that this motor came with the 722-6 Mercedes transmission. It's a fantastic transmission. As far as I know, as far as my experience goes, it's basically bulletproof. We've never really had issues with them. But it is electronically controlled. Okay, so here's the big problem with that. To get this transmission working, you need a few things. I mean, it's not super complicated, but you definitely need to get it sorted out. So to get this transmission fitted into pretty much any other vehicle, you're going to need the transmission control module. All right, easy enough. And you're going to need the ABS module from your donor vehicle. Now, this transmission came into Sprinters and E-Class and C-Class, S-Class. I'm pretty sure it's used across the board for Mercedes. But you will need the ABS controller of whatever vehicle it came in. And the problem with that is the ABS controller itself then requires the 4 speed sensors off the wheels. So to actually make the transmission work without limp mode, you need to have your transmission, all of the wiring that came with the transmission control module, the ABS, all of the wiring that came with the speed sensors, and the speed sensors themselves getting valid signals. 2 ways to go about doing that is to either mount and retrofit the stock sensors and the stock speed wheels onto the car, or what some folks have done is to get the 4 sensors mounted around the drive shaft and basically have one wheel on the drive shaft that feeds the exact same signal to the wheels at all times. It's not very clean, and frankly, it's a little bit time consuming. It's more complicated than I'm comfortable with on this particular project. The second option we're getting the 722.6 is to have a standalone controller, which gets rid of the complication of having the ABS and the transmission control module. However, it's expensive. Last I checked, it was upwards of about $1,500. It's a great option. It's certainly, if that's the way you want to go, and if you want to have this transmission into any other vehicle, it's probably worth saving yourself the hours and hours and hours of trying to fit the stock system, and you just get this controller. But for this particular project, it will push us past my budget, and I don't want to do that. This is the reason why originally, when I started building the 201, I did not consider this motor. Now, we've had it for years. It's been sitting in the garage, like I said earlier. But I didn't consider it as a viable option because I did not want to deal with the transmission. The engine, I was less worried about because, okay, sure, I can get a mechanical pump, worst case scenario, and get this motor running. Not a big deal. But the transmission, you're going to have a hard time sort of cheating the system without getting it what it needs. And I've had people contact me through the Sprinter builds that I've done, asking me when they swapped the OM647, which is the 5-cylinder common rail version of this, into other vehicles, why are the transmissions always stuck in limp mode? And that's the biggest hurdle that you're going to overcome, is you need to find a way to give this transmission the signals that it needs to get it working. I don't have the time to deal with that. It's not impossible. It's been done. There's a thread about it. There's a guy that actually did swap this in exact block into this exact vehicle, and he had to retrofit the speed sensors into the stock hubs and a few other things. So I'm not interested in doing that. It's a little past the time that I have. Lucky for me, this motor, the 606, when it was first introduced in the W124 chassis, actually used the 722.4 transmission that came stock on my 602. Okay, that is now sounding a little bit better because I have two of those transmissions in fairly good condition, and as long as I can put that transmission on that motor, half of my problems go away because the car is already built to accept that transmission. All of the signals and everything else are going to line up. The shifter is going to be there. I won't have to do any custom work to make the transmission work. So once I figured that out, this became a viable project for the vehicle, because what I'm going to do now is get that transmission, the 722.4, mounted onto the OM606 using the immobilizer defeat, which kind of gets rid of all of my problems for fitting this engine in the car. Now I'm saying this and I'm thinking I'm going to come up with a ton of other issues that, it's obviously not going to fit as is. I'm going to have to get rid of a bunch of stuff, but I'm hopeful that it's going to resolve 99% of the problems from a mechanical point of view anyways. Chances are you're now saying, are you crazy? This transmission will not handle the horsepower, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, this transmission came in stock into a whole lot of other vehicles with much bigger engines than 602, with a lot more horsepower than the 602. So I'm not too worried about the fact that I may end up blowing a transmission, because you know what, if I do, it's not a big deal. They're easy to find. I have a spare, and frankly, my dad's not going to drive this in any sort of crazy fashion that can start wearing out this transmission. Both of these transmissions are pretty good. The 722.4 and the 722.6 are solely Mercedes transmissions. And I don't have the luxury, being in Canada, I don't have the luxury to go manual, even though that would have been the best option. There's very little supply. Like, I'm going to have a very hard time finding a manual transmission to put on behind this motor, to put in this car in the short time frame. Not impossible, it's clearly been done, but I'm going to have a hard time doing it. So let's summarize. The plan is to use the OM606 with a defeated immobilizer and the stock wiring harness with the stock computer, made it to the 722.4 transmission that came stock with this vehicle. I think mechanically that solves most, if not all, of my problems. And that is kind of based on a few assumptions. Now, I would love to hear from you. If you have experience with this swap in the W201 chassis, please comment below and let me know if there's anything major that I'm missing, or if perhaps some of my information is wrong. Let me know if there were major hurdles that I'm not accounting for putting that in, because I'm gonna jump into this project sort of both feet because I want to get this in the car as fast as possible. The suspension is only a couple of weeks away from getting back on the car. So after that, this is the only thing that's left over for me to do. Now I'm going to end the video here because I don't want to go too far down into this without getting some feedback from you guys. Please go ahead and comment on this. Let me know what I'm missing. And then in the next video, I should have the transmission mated to the engine and the engine inside the car, which then gives us some confidence that I can go ahead and actually physically fit it. So therefore, the next step will be to strip everything down, clean it, build it back up, put some new gaskets on the car, get the immobilizer defeated, and throw it back in the car and actually get it started. All right, that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for joining me. If you do like the content and you want to see more about this engine going into the W201, click subscribe, give me the thumbs up, let me know what you think about the project overall, and I really hope to see you next time. All right, take it easy.